Let's take a look at the asset catalog, and therefore to the left of our project where all of our files are located. Let's select the assets.xassets file. This is the so-called asset catalog that was automatically created with our project. Inside of the catalog, we can save graphics and define a lot of different things for resolutions, memory, and so on. We already have the image for our spaceship here. And if I select it, I can already see that for Universal we have 3 different scales: 1x, 2x, and 3x. What this does is it allows us to add images in Retina resolution, so in twice or 3 times the size with more pixels. If we use this asset in our app, then it will automatically recognize that it is twice the resolution and will accordingly size the image or even use 3 times the size that we have in here. If we have an asset selected, we have our area to the right where we can define a lot more. For example, we can add graphics that are not universally used, but only for iPhones by checking this box. And we can now see more fields here for iPhones. The same goes for iPad, Apple Watch, Apple TV, and so on. Whatever we need, we find here. There are also other things concerning the device that we are running on, for example, whether we have 1, 2, or 4 gigs of RAM. We can also choose height and width classes, and just like that, add a lot more images to perfectly fit this one asset on any given occasion, depending on which device in which orientation the app is currently running on. Most of the time though, it will be sufficient to add images as universal, so we will probably not have to create a bunch of different sizes of each graphic that we are using. What we want to do now is, in our asset catalog, create a so-called sprite atlas. To do that, let's right-click in the blank space below our spaceship and then select New Sprite Atlas. The first thing I want to do is rename this atlas to Dog Frames. You will see why in a second. But first of all, what is a sprite atlas? What does it even mean? A sprite atlas will combine all assets contained to one bigger image, which will load as one asset in our app instead of loading multiple smaller images. This mainly is done for performance advantages, since it is only one load instead of a lot of smaller but multiple loads. I have added some files here that you can download, and we will need these now. So if you haven't already downloaded them, please do so now. And once you're done, open this folder, Dog Frames, which contains 8 frames of the animation of a running cartoon dog. If we just quickly click through the images, we can already see how the animation can look. I will now take all of the 8 images and drag them into my Dog Frames Sprite Atlas in the asset catalog. There is an empty sprite in here that got created with the atlas, which I can simply delete since we will not need it. I can then use the sprite atlas containing all of the frames for our animated dog to work in code. I will reference it with its name, Dog Frames, just like I referenced the spaceship graphic with its name, Spaceship. I will also need to know the names of my images in it. In our case, run 0 up to run 7. And it will always make sense to enumerate the frames of an animation, which we will see in a second when we are going to use a for loop that will allow us to easily get all images in the right order. Let's head back into our game scene, which I completely emptied for this example. And right at the top, we will begin by creating 2 properties. The first one will be a SK sprite node for our dog as letDogSpriteNode, initialized as a SK sprite node with the image named run0. I could have taken any image from our frames, but I will use the first one as the static image for our sprite. Next is a variable called dogFrames, initialized as an empty array, which will accept the type SK texture or SpriteKit texture. Even if the initializer for our sprite node above is conveniently called image named, the images in sprite nodes are actually SK textures under the hood. So if we want to animate a sprite with different frames, we have to provide each frame as an SK texture. Before we can do that, we want to add the dog sprite to our scene and position it right in the center. Why don't you try to remember how we did this and give it a go on your own? All I need to do is set dog sprite node.position to a new CG point with the coordinates frame.midx and frame.midy. To position our sprite in the center of the scene, and then use add child and dog sprite node to actually add the dog sprite as a child to our scene. We now have to refer our sprite atlas so that we are able to get our frames, and we will use the type SK texture atlas to do so. So let's do let texture atlas and set it to SK texture atlas named dog frames, which is the name of our sprite atlas in the asset catalog. I can, however, not just pass this atlas to an animation action, but I need to retrieve all the textures from it, and then I'm able to pass them to the action. So to do so, I will use a for loop like so. For index in 0 up to less than texture atlas.texture names.count, which will give us the right amount of loops to get through every image contained in the atlas. Inside of the loop, I will create a constant texture name, which should get the name of the current image. Again, I can get it by defining a string and then writing run, which is the name of all of the frames, followed by the numbers 0 up to 7. I can easily append the numbers by just adding the string of our counter variable index to the string run. Index will in this for loop be 0 up to 7, so it will work perfectly. Now that I have the image name, I can add it to our dog frames array, which is the property we have defined in the game scene class, by writing dog frames.append and then adding texture atlas.texture named texture name. Texture atlas.texture named will return a certain texture from the atlas, and we will use the name defined in the line above to get all of our frames one by one and adding them to our array. As soon as the for loop is finished, I will have all of the frames saved in dog frames. Our animation should be started in our touchesBegan method, just like we did in the video about SK actions. If you think you are up for a challenge, you can look up the animate methods in our cheat sheet and see if you can implement it completely on your own. For those of you that think they need a little more guidance or practice, we're now going to begin together and add a smaller challenge in a second. To run the action on our sprite, we will start by writing dog sprite node.run action, and the action will be a skaction.repeat action forever, since we want to animate our sprite continuously and not just once. The action to repeat will be skaction.animate, and we have a bunch of options here. I will use the most basic version that takes an array of SK textures and a time interval per frame. The array is of course our array dog frames, and time per frame will be set to 0.1. You can play around with this value a little bit to see what you like the most. This will just change the speed of the actual animation. Okay, the small challenge that I promised is I want you to wrap this in an if statement so that we can tap to start the animation and the second tap stops the animation, just like we did with our SK action earlier. So maybe you remember how we did that. Okay, pause the video and give it a go. Did you manage to finish our little challenge? Great, if not, don't worry. We'll do it together now. We have to check if dog sprite node dot has actions, and if this returns true, we do not have any running actions on our dog sprite. Therefore, we will add the action with the line we just implemented. In the else part, we want to stop the animation, and therefore we will remove the action with dog sprite node dot remove all actions. Even though this might have been a little bit more complicated or complex than the chapters before, I think we can agree on the fact that we did not write that much code, and it is actually pretty clear to see what we are doing. If we now run the app, we will see that we have already created a cool animation for our dog that we can start and stop, and just like that, we have implemented a very important element of almost any game, a sprite or character that is able to move and is not just a static image. As the app starts, we see the static sprite of our dog, just like we had our spaceship earlier on. If we now tap, we can see our running animation. And a second click stops the animation, just like we learned with SK actions, right at the last frame. Other animate actions can influence this, to, for example, reset to the original frame or things like that. But we will take this result that we've gotten here. We have used our asset catalog and a sprite atlas in combination with some code to create an awesome running dog animation.